conference, it's recorded.
All right, make sure the camera is. Let's see.
Well, Rick, we don't know. We got our wish list probably later this week. That's all my wife is home. We got to, that's
All right.
great. There's- I'm sure we can make it another day.
Am I ready?
This hearing will come to order. Before the commission today is docket number 16-036-FR, which is styled in the matter of formula rate from the filings of Entergy Arkansas East pursuant to APSC docket number 15-015-U. This hearing was scheduled by order number 28, which is in this docket on August 17, 2020. Before we get started, please silence the telephones. If you have to take a call, please do so out in the hall. Also, if you want to access the commission's wireless, we can mention all that you are to where Zoom function. Well, you already know that. Okay. This hearing is also being broadcast on YouTube pursuant to order number 36, which contains the link to our YouTube channel, Arkansas PSC. This is the commission's first hearing using live and Zoom technology. You have received instructions on hearing procedures from the Commission's Chief Administrative Law Judge. Please follow those instructions. For remote participants, please follow the instructions and let us know as quickly as possible if you are disconnected or have any issues by emailing the contact that you were given in the instructions. We have technical difficulties during the hearing. We will ask everybody to be patient with them to make time to break to work through technical issues. Persons in the hearing room should have their sound muted and their audio will come through the hearing room sound system. Witnesses appearing remotely should have their Zoom on mute unless they are testifying. Attorneys appearing remotely may have their computers on mute unless they're conducting questions or addressing the commission. I'll remind everyone that witnesses, remind the witness that the attorney, either live or remote, makes an objection. The witness needs to pause until instructed to proceed by the commission. Please pay particular attention to the sound stuff. That's a technical challenge that we've had, is merging the Zoom sound and the YouTube sound and the audio and the room sound. So please pay particular attention to the sound instructions. Persons appearing live are required to wear masks to maintain social distancing at all times in the building. We have the little hand sanitizer stuff around. For the record, will attorneys please state their appearance and the names of the person they intend to call as witnesses? Start with A.A.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I'm Matthew Suffern. I'm appearing on behalf of Entergy Arkansas LLC. With me at council table is Scott Olson with the firm of Evans Rand, and our witnesses today are Myra Talkington and William Cunningham.
Thank you, and all the excitement, I forgot to log into Zoom myself, so. I'm gonna do that.
Gotcha.
No.
So it sounds like it's good here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Suffolk. Now we, guess that was
Mr. Chairman, if, would it be helpful to repeat that if anyone online didn't get it?
Yes, let's go on and do that. We're kind of moving it.
Certainly. My name is Matthew Suffren. I'm appearing on behalf of MPG Arkansas LLC. With me is Scott Olson with the firm of Doug and Dren, who will be co-counsel today. Our witnesses today are Myra Coffington and William Cunningham. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. And for AEC,
Honor, is it permissible to remain seated, so I'm visible in the Zoom platform?
that's fine.
Thank you, guys. My name is Jordan Tinsley, I am the counsel for Arkansas Electric Energy Consumers Incorporated. My co-counsel is Sean McMurray, and the witness we are presenting today is Mr. Billy Wilcox.
Thanks, sir.
Thank
For
you.
hospitals and higher education group.
Looks like he's trying to talk.
Yeah, you bring this audio up, I think.
We cannot yet hear you. Or I cannot yet hear you.
Cannot yet hear you. Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good.
Yes, can you hear me now? Yes. Can you hear me now? I'm sorry, I lost audio for a minute. This is Randall Lyon on behalf of hospital and higher education. We will not be presenting any witnesses today.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have for the Attorney General.
Good morning, Chairman. Michael Savington on behalf of the Arkansas Attorney General. We presenting one witness today, Christina Baker.
Thanks, sir. And for general staff.
Commissioner Rick Leeper, appearing on behalf of the Arkansas General Staff, Arkansas Public Service Commission General Staff. We will be presenting today Judy K. Lindstrom and Donna Correa.
Thanks, sir. All witnesses, both live and remote, would please stand and raise your right hand to be sworn. You swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you. You may please be seated. Based upon the stipulation filed by the parties on October 30th, 2020, the purpose of today's hearing list is limited to one contested issue. The remaining issues in this case have been settled by the parties and submitted to the commission on the filed record. Based on the October 30th, 2020 stipulation, is the commission understanding that all parties voted cross-examination on all of the uncontested issues. Commission notes that pursuant to order 36, all witnesses except 3 testifying on the contested issue and the 3 settlement witnesses were excused from the hearing. Pursuant to this stipulation, the parties have stipulated that the admission of all pre-filed, stipulated to the admission of all pre-filed testimony, and we allow the parties to introduce all pre-filed testimony into the record for the first witness stand. Also, please note that the commission finds law and hearing rule will be in effect during this hearing. You don't want to cross-examine the witnesses completed and the witnesses intended for questioning to the commission. Further redirect or cross the witness will not be permitted. For purpose of the record, either is no objection to that. Yes. Okay, the objection is noted. Further, the parties are reminded that this case includes protected information, including highly sensitive protected information. Members of the public are advised that the hearing remaining to be from time to time clear, with the exception of the parties who sign proper affidavits, which is case will affect the YouTube. In such a case, the broadcast will be prolonged to be paused. The parties are advised to inform the commission if and when the parties wish to condense the record of confidential information. In which case, the commission will determine whether or not to go and remove opening statements. At today's hearing, the parties have pre-filed those opening statements. They are available on the commission's website for the general public. Pursuant to order number 36, because of the current state of emergency due to COVID-19, we will not be taking public comments today at this hearing and live presentation. Public comments may be made on the commission's website or by radio or mail. Contact information is included in order 36. Also, the public comment system, you can look at the website and make it public. This time, if the attorney would like to introduce all pre-file testimony for the record, I guess we'll proceed then. Well, are there any motions that we need to consider before we do that? Other processes? And we will proceed with the introduction of pre-file testimony.
Enters the Arkansas tenders for the record all of its pre-file testimony and exhibits, which include the application, the evaluation report, responses to errors and objections, KC direct testimony and exhibits, KC rebuttal testimony and exhibits, Castleberry direct historical year testimony, Castleberry direct projected year testimony, Castleberry rebuttal testimony, Caliper direct historical year testimony, Caliper direct projected year testimony, Cunningham HSBI direct testimony and exhibits, Cunningham redacted direct testimony and exhibits.
Just sort of please review, we're getting some clacking feedback. Please proceed.
Did the court reporter get Cunningham redacted direct testimony and exhibits? Cunningham HSPI rebuttal testimony and exhibits. Cunningham redacted rebuttal testimony and exhibits. Cunningham settlement testimony. Cunningham supplemental settlement testimony and exhibits. John HSPI direct testimony and exhibits. John redacted direct testimony and exhibits. John rebuttal testimony and exhibits. The stipulation, amended joint issues list, and request to excuse witnesses. The joint motion partial settlement agreement. Joseph direct testimony. Landrew direct testimony. Scarpet direct historical year testimony. Scarpet direct projected year testimony. Scarpet rebuttal testimony. Talkington direct testimony. Talkington rebuttal testimony and exhibits. Talkington settlement testimony. Taylor direct historical year testimony. Taylor direct projected year testimony. Taylor rebuttal testimony and exhibits. Rayleigh rebuttal testimony. I know that Ms. Talkington and Mr. Cunningham have a few minor errata to make the rebuttal testimony today when they testify. That DL requests that these documents be admitted into the record.
The evidence cited by Mr. Olson, or the exhibit cited by Mr. Olson, we've been to the record to the situation. Mr. Kinsley?
Your Honor, Mr. McMurray is actually handing that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. AEC has the HSBI direct testimony of Billy McConkey and the DAC direct testimony of Billy McConkey. I have that on hand. Should I put that to the report?
Yes, please. Exhibits referenced by Mr. McMurray will be admitted in record by stipulation. Next, Mr. Bynum.
And I think Mr. Olson may have wanted to address the commission.
Okay, sorry about that.
Sorry about this, sir. My list had a mistaken entry on it. Talkington settlement testimony is not part of the record. She did not file testimony.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, sir, for the correction. Mr. Bynum.
Yes, Chairman, so we do not file any testimony about this.
Mr. Sappington for the Attorney General.
Thank you, Chairman. The Attorney General is going to submit the redacted direct testimony of Dr. Disputes, the redacted direct exhibits of Dr. Disputes, the highly sensitive protected
version of Dr. Disney's direct testimony, the highly sensitive, protected version of Dr. Disney's direct exhibits, presenting Mr. Norwood's redacted direct testimony, Mr. Norwood's redacted direct exhibits, the HSPI version of Mr. Norwood's direct testimony, and the HSPI version of Mr. Norwood's direct exhibits. We'll also be presenting Christina Baker's direct testimony supporting the stipulation, which is noted to be corrected as it includes the errata that we filed for a single page. This version.
Okay, sir, the exhibit referenced by Mr. Sappington will be admitted for some stipulation. General staff,
Commissioner, I have my list with me, and I can't seem to find it on my computer here, but what we are going to submit to the CD-ROM disk is all of the filings from staff dated October 5th, 2020, along with Ms. Gray's stipulation testimony dated October 30th, 2020. There are also some errata filings that are going to be submitted on that CD-ROM. Basically, Ms. Gray's errata filing. And we have also here live at the hearing today, two hearing exhibits, one of which is the Formula Rate Review Act, which is ACA 23-4-1201, etc. And the FRP tariff, which consists of 33 pages extracted from the general EAL tariff that is currently in effect.
okay, sir, the reference testimony will be admitted for some stipulation.
And we also have on the CD-ROM, the response to the errors and objections itself.
And the CD-ROM has been presented to the court report.
It will be, okay. I'll have to run up to it and get, or hobble up to it and get it.
Thanks, sir.
Your Honor, may I ask a clarifying question? We did circulate a number of potential hearing exhibits prior to the hearing, but they were not put on our disk. If those are admitted, could we submit a supplemental disk, or will the commission be responsible for transmitting those to the court reporter? I mean, we complied with the procedural order to submit them to the ALJ yesterday.
So you need something, will you seek admission when you're handling them today? Will that solve that problem?
Yes, Your Honor, I'm just curious about how we should actually supply them to the court reporter.
Whatever's easier for her, and we'll have something that we circulate and touch today, and it's easier for her to take that information on a CD-ROM.
Should we just talk to her about that off the record and kind of get her feedback on that, Your Honor?
Yes, and the other parties as well, to make sure that if any parties have any questions, I want to make sure that that which is on the CD-ROM is that what's discussed.
That's fine, Your Honor, but I think we can work through all that.
Okay. Thanks, sir.
Yes, sir.
And I hope the others, I hope that all the rebates exhibits have been circulated like that. And we'll deal with that issue as the exhibits. Yeah. Are you good with that?
I'll take care of it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. With that, there's nothing else to do. Mr. Olson, please call your first witness.
Yeah, we call, it's Larry Hawkington. I understand we need to take our seats off there.
Yes. I think they're designated here.
This one down here. Morning, Ms. Hopkinton, would you please state your name and business address for the record?
Myra Hopkinton, 425 West Capitol Avenue, Little Rock, Arkansas.
Are you the same Myra Hopkinton who filed direct and rebuttal testimony in this proceeding?
Yes, I am.
Do you have any corrections to make to your rebuttal testimony today?
I do have a few minor number changes. So if you start on page 13, the first one is on page 13 of my rebuttal testimony on line 8. The number 67,490,286 should be changed to 67,400,527. 67400,527. Second change is on page 14, line 1, it's the same change. 67,490,286 should be changed to 67,400,527. On page 15, excuse me, again, the same change, 67,490,286 should be 67,400,527. Also on line 3, 26,228,881 should be changed to 26,318,640. 26318. And then finally on line 5 of page 15, 67,490,286 should be changed to 67,400,527. That's all.
With that, Mr. Chairman, we can do the witness for cross-examination.
Ms. Hopkinton, thank you for your indulgence while I get situated here. How are you doing this morning?
Good, thank you.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I'd like to ask you a few questions about EAL's position in this matter. I'm going to make reference to several documents that are already in the record regarding this matter. I'm not sure that all of those were circulated because they're not technically hearing exhibits. And so if for some reason I refer to a document that you don't have, please let me know and I'll try to rectify that. I could probably just email it to you if that would work. The first document that I would like you to look at is order number 7, which was entered in this docket, but it seems like a really long time ago. Are you familiar with order number 7?
I am not.
Okay. So you're not familiar with the procedural history in this docket?
I am familiar with the history of order number, there are a lot of orders in this document.
Yes, ma'am.
Specifically order number 7, I will have to show it to you, so that I can reference it to you.
Okay. Would you have a copy of it with you?
If you want.
Is it acceptable if I email it to you real quick?
As long as-
That works.
Should I copy the chief ALJ, Your Honor?
That would be good. Probably good.
Look at her, she's shaking her head.
We shouldn't have, I don't think this is the problem.
Order number 7, thank you, Your Honor. Thank you.
I guess Ms. Hawkins thinks you know what we need after she receives it.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Olson, I should have offered to send it to you as well. And I appreciate everyone's indulgence. I know we're all kind of mulling through this. Okay, it's showing that it's synced on my end and stuff. Your Honor, I do know how to share my screen on Zoom, if that would be easier. I'm happy to try that.
Awesome.
Okay, Ms. Talkington, can you see that on the Zoom platform now?
Yes.
Okay. And I'll show you the very first page if that helps, so you can hopefully recognize this document. Does that appear to be order number 7 issued in this matter back in December of 2016? Okay. Any reason to doubt that that's what it is? I'm going to call your attention to pages 50 and 51 of that document. Appreciate everyone's indulgence. Okay. So this is a section of the order labeled findings and rulings, correct? And your familiarity with the procedural history would lead you to understand that this is a commission ruling on a contested matter back in the very first FRP filing, correct?
It was ordered, yeah, it was issued in 2016, and was then ordered to the year 2017. So, yeah.
And back then, we were still fighting about when we could challenge prudence, correct? You see subsection A, timing and nature of prudence determinations.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to read a portion of the order, and I want you to follow along and tell me if I've read it correctly. It says, the true-up process is limited to netting the difference in the projected and historical year with a separate and distinct prudence review for examining significant variances to see if the utility mismanaged the project, which might result in a disallowance of a level of costs. Did I read that correctly?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to just help everybody get a little bit oriented. And I think in order to do that, it helps to establish sort of the nomenclature regarding some of the things we're talking about. So this year is 2020, obviously, in the midst of a presidential election, so we all know what year it is, I hope. In the nomenclature of the FRP tariff, the current year is called the filing year, is that correct? And the projected year in the nomenclature of the FRP tariff would be 2021, correct?
Correct.
And again, in the nomenclature of the FRP tariff, the historic year would be what?
The historic year for the 2020 following year is 2019.
Right. And so let's go all the way back to the beginning. Entergy's first FRP filing was made in 2016, correct?
That's correct.
And so that year, 2016 would have been the filing year, correct? And we were projecting costs and revenues for 2017, correct?
That is correct.
And there was, in fact, no historic year in that filing, correct?
That's
In 2017 filing year, the projected year would have been 18, right? And the historic year would have been 16, right?
No, it was 27.
There was no historic year again in that file, right? Because we didn't have actuals for the historic year at that point, is that correct?
Because the word historic year was there, it was 2017, not 20.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. I appreciate that clarification. And so if you push all that forward, typically the filing year is the current year, the projected year is the year after that, and the historic year is the preceding year. Is that correct? Okay. Let's talk about the operation of the FRQ tariff generally, okay? As I understand it, in a year where there is a netting adjustment, that would be calculated early, correct, in the operation of the tariff?
I don't really understand what you mean early in the operation.
Well, it's one of the two numbers that you have to derive before you can apply the cap, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. The calculation is made for projected years and we have the fee schedule. The calculation for the historical netting, meaning the fee schedule, the results of those calculations are brought forward to the attachment A2 where the projected or the change in FRP revenue.
Can you speak up just a little, or pull your mic closer? I thought it was just me.
Okay, I'm sorry, I know these masks.
No, yeah, it's difficult. Thank you,
Okay, do you need me to start over on that?
if you will.
Okay, so, Mr. Tinsley asked me if the historical year of netting is done first or how it works. And as I was explaining, the calculation in a year, filing year, where we have both a projected year and historical year, the projected year is calculated, the ROE adjustment is calculated on the fee schedule. The ROE adjustment, the actual ROE adjustment for the netting calculation is on the fee schedule. After those have been calculated, then those changes in revenue are brought forward to the attachment A2 schedule. And that is the point that the total change in revenue from the combination of those two schedules is compared to the 4% cap constraint calculation.
Okay, so let me just try to pair up what you said and make sure I have it right. First, you've got to derive two numbers. You have to derive the netting adjustment calculation and the band rate adjustment or the projected year adjustment as you described, right?
Yes, that's how
And then you sum those two numbers, correct?
that's correct. Both of them are shown on attachment A2.
Correct, and we'll get to that. And once you've summed those two numbers, you calculate the cap and apply the cap to the sum of those two numbers, correct?
You compare the cap constraints to the sum of the two numbers, and if the sum of the two numbers by class, it's a class, not in total company, it's a class by class calculation. In the class, revenue changes from B and schedules B and D are greater than the cap constraint for each class. Then the company is limited to that cap constraint for the change in revenue that's then dropped and brought into the calculation of the rates that will be applied in the projected year.
And by that same token, if there was a credit to ratepayers, it would be limited by the low end of the cap calculation, right?
That's true, it goes both ways.
It does. And the same thing is true for the netting adjustment, right? It goes both ways. Meaning that it could result in a credit to ratepayers or it could result in an under recovery by the company, correct?
Yes, by the very nature of a netting adjustment, you can have an over recovery that needs to be refunded to customers, or you can have an under recovery where the company needs to collect additional dollars for the historical year.
And you have said, I think in several places, that EAL is entitled to a netting adjustment. Is that correct?
Yes, the, at 725 FRRA, refers to it, calls for a netting adjustment, and says itself calls for a netting adjustment.
Well, let's give the obligatory disclaimer, which is that you're not a lawyer, right?
So I'm not a lawyer, but I can read.
Right, right, and we can all read the law, right? You agree with that? And so 23-4-1206E1, since you acknowledge that you can read the law, says, if a formula rate review test period utilizes projected data under 23-4-406 or a projected year, rate changes under 23-4-1207 shall include an adjustment to net any differences between the prior formula rate review test period change in revenue and the actual historical year change in revenue for that same year. And let me show you a copy of that. I should have done that earlier. I think the staff provided that as a hearing exhibit, so we can access it relatively easily. Do you see that there on your screen now, E1? Okay. I want to ask you some questions about your understanding of what a term in this means. It says a formula rate review test period. What's your understanding of what that means?
Now, a test period is typically 12 months of data, a 12-month period of time for the cost, or the reviewing cost, revenue collected cost from the commission.
Mm-hmm. So it's utilizing the term of art test period, but it's qualified by the term formula rate review, right?
Yes, if a formula rate review test period utilizes projected data under 23-4-4-6, this is exactly what EAL has elected to use a projected test year.
Mm-hmm. Then it says there shall be an adjustment to net any differences between the prior formula rate review test period change in revenue and the actual historical year change in revenue for that same year. Did I read that correctly?
Not quite. It says rate changes under section 23-4-1207 shall include an adjustment to net any differences between the prior formula rate review test period change in revenue and the actual historical year change in revenue for that same year. Very important that you don't skip that rate change.
I agree, and I appreciate you clarifying. But the reference there to the prior formula rate review test period change in revenue, how do you understand that?
As the EAL FRP works, we elected a projected year format. So in our first, as Mr. Kinsley pointed out earlier, in our first FRP filing, which was in 2016, our projected test year was 2017. We presented the results of the calculations, and the commission approved an amount for us to collect during 2017 based on that projected test year. In 2018, when we made our filing, I'm jumping to 2018, when we made our filing in 2018, it included two parts. It included the netting adjustment for 2017, because in 2017 had been completed, and so we had actual. And we, so the 2018 filing year included a netting adjustment for 2017 and the projected year ROE adjustment for 2019. rates that were approved in the 2018 FRP went into effect, which I might add, the rates that were approved to go into effect in 2019 included both a true-up adjustment calculated on attachment B and an ROE adjustment for 2019. The rates included both portions of that. And that rate was being billed during 2019. So during 2019, we were collecting revenues pursuant to a rate that included a true up for 2017, the netting adjustment for 2017, and the projected ROE adjustment for 2019.
With all due respect, Ms. Talkington, I don't think you answered my question. My question is, what does the term, the prior formula rate review test period change in revenue mean in this law? What's your understanding of it?
Well, Mr. Kinder, that's exactly what I tried to explain, that
Well, I think you gave us the procedural history of several years of filings. I'm asking you what the words
can you put it up on the screen?
mean. Sure. Let me ask you this. That means the prior projected year, right? The projected year for the year that now is the comparison to the historic year, correct?
I'm not very following. Can you say that again, please?
Okay.
So you're wanting a definition of formula rate review test period?
I'm wanting your interpretation of the words, the prior formula rate review test period, right there. Is that just the projected year that correlates to the historical year? The prior projected year, I should say?
The prior formula rate review test period. To me, knowing the history of the FRP and how the FRP has worked, if a year was projected and rates were put in pursuant to that projection, then the prior formula rate review test period would be the historic actual result from that originally projected test year.
Okay, so you're saying if that means the historic, how are you comparing the historic to the historic? The statute says you compare that to the historical year. So how can you compare it to itself?
Well, with all due respect, I don't think that's what it's saying.
Well, does it not say that you net the differences between that, whatever it means, and the actual historical year change in revenue? Isn't that what the statute requires?
Yes, but if you look at number 3, it says netting shall not begin until a public utility has accumulated a full 12 months of historical year to compare a report.
Right.
The very definition or in order to net something, you have to compare two things.
Right.
If we projected a year, then you want to compare. Again, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know.
So let's just keep it real simple. This says you compare your projection to the historic, right?
Yes, I believe that's what
Okay, and so that reference, the prior formula rate review test period, refers to the projected year that was correlated to the historic year that you now have because you've accumulated the 12 months under subsection 3, right?
yes, Mr. Sims, I believe that's exactly what I have been saying.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. This is complicated. Okay, so So this requires a comparison, a netting between the projected year and the historical year for that same year, right?
Yes, if you projected 2017, then you will have a netting adjustment which compares the revenue collected pursuant to that projection to the actual ROE bandwidth change that the actual data produces.
Okay, so if the historic year is 2017, you're looking at the PY for 2017 to net the differences, right?
I'm looking at the revenue collected. You look at attachment B, where the calculation is made. I'm going to compare the revenue that I collected pursuant to the projected year calculation. I'm going to compare that revenue to the actual ROE adjustment based on the historical actual amount.
Right. And in some years, the revenue that's being collected is the sum of a netting adjustment and an ROE band rate adjustment, right?
No, the revenue that we collect in any given year has to be looked at in light of the attachment A2 that was prepared to calculate the rates. So if
So-
A2 included both an ROE band adjustment for the projected year and a historical netting adjustment, meaning we either owe customers money or they would owe us money for any shortfall, then the revenue that's collected in that next year is a combination of both of those pieces plus any ongoing revenue that's already being collected.
Okay. So I think that was actually a yes and not a no.
It was a clarification that it's not as simple as saying it's a combination. You have to look at the pieces in order to understand the whole
But that's the
picture.
company's position, right?
You asked me to explain as I understand it, and that's exactly how I'm explaining.
Okay, so let's look at attachment A2. You see that on your screen?
I do.
So look at line 9. That says ROE band rate adjustment, right?
It does.
Okay. And you said that is coming from a B6 schedule.
It is.
Okay, so that's, again, calculated early in the process, right? Before you apply the cap.
Yes, it was tax line.
Okay, and then underneath that on line 10, you have the so-called netting adjustment, right?
Yes.
And again, that's coming from attachment D6, right?
That's right.
Okay, and then on a line 11, you have the net change in required FRP revenue, which this year the company purports to be $68.3 million, right?
That's correct.
Line 11 is the sum of lines 9 and 10, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and then up above that, we've calculated the constraint on lines 3 through 7, right?
Yes.
And then down below that, you apply the constraint to line 11, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And that is how attachment A2 calculates the change in revenue, correct?
It does. You have to take into account all of the pieces that make up the amount that shows up on line 14.
Right. And then down on line 19, we derive those percentages, and those are the percentages that are applied to base rates through the write-up, correct?
Yes, during the projected year.
And so that bumps up rates by 20%, let's say, at least as it appears on this document. And
And
then,
the cumulative amount, it's not the
Sure.
same year over year, it's a cumulative.
agreed. But that is how the writer results in the collection of revenues, right?
That's correct.
So everybody gets a bill. And if they're a residential customer, their bill is bumped up, assuming you win, 20.82%, right? Assuming Entergy wins, that'll be the cumulative rate increase that's billed through the right.
Well,
Right.
Mr. Timms, I believe this is on the, yeah, this is based on the settlement, so
Yeah, but it presumes that you win the netting adjustment, doesn't it?
that was what we filed, yes.
Right.
We filed before we do that.
Well, the settlement has that as a contested
Yes,
issue.
and it-
Okay, but the 23 million that's reflected on line 10 of this exhibit is the company's position, right? If we win, that number would be like negative 40 million, right?
yeah.
Okay. But you will agree that that's the way the writer creates revenue for the company. It bills a percentage increase in base rates, right?
It bills a percentage to base rate if the number on line 11 was a negative number that came down to line 14, then the rate would go down
Sure.
from what was billed last year, so
Sure.
it would be decreased.
Right.
Customers' bill.
But if that percentage is positive, you're collecting revenue, and if that percentage is negative, you're giving it back, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So, where does it say on this document, where does it say that you're not collecting line 9?
I don't understand the question.
Is there any reference on this document that says that when you're collecting revenues through line 19, that that does not include line 9?
No, it's very clear that the 68,316,978 on line 14 includes both the ROE band adjustment of 44 million and the netting adjustment of 23.8 million.
And attachment A2 has worked this way for every year.
Except for the filing year 2016 and 2017, when you didn't have a netting adjustment, because you didn't have a historical year that you had at that point.
Okay, so there's nothing in this document that says you're not collecting line 9.
Now, again, I agree, the 68 million that we're collecting includes both the 44.5 and the 23.9.
As an example, right?
as we did.
And that would have been true in 2019, correct?
That was in 2019.
And it would have been true in 18, right?
Yes, it included the netting adjustment for 2017.
Okay, so let's look at one of your hearing exhibits. Okay, you said the 2018 evaluation report, you see that?
I did.
And that's a graph that you prepared, is it not? Okay. All the way on the right side, you've got a big green blob at the top, right? It says $69,213,357. And if you look at the key down here, it says ROE band unrecovered, right?
That's correct.
Where in the tariff or the law does anything say that that's not recovered?
Well, I think we need to.
Just answer my question, Ms. Talkington. Does the law or the tariff say that that amount of money is unrecovered?
Mr. Chairman, I want to answer your question, but no, it does not say that 69,213, I can't see the purchase line, is unrecovered. So,
Okay, so that's the answer to my question. It does
no,
not say.
I'm sorry.
Your Honor, they have redirect.
We can just talk and let her conclude and answer.
I think she did, Your Honor. That's not. The answer is there's nothing in the law or the tariff that says you can characterize that $69 million as unrecovered. You agree?
There's nothing in the law or tariff that mentions $69,213,357.
Well, there's actually nothing in the tariff that segregates that money from the 27 million or the 66.6 million, is there?
Well, I think we need to look at the attachment A, this corresponds to this year, and I think I can explain it a little.
Well, you can do that with your attorneys. Is there anything in the law or the tariff that says you can segregate these amounts?
I believe I've answered the question.
Well, the question didn't pertain, didn't, his question didn't go to Schedule A, you, of course, on redirect and getting to Schedule A.
My objection was setting this off, not allowing it.
Okay, so do you think you've answered that question?
Maybe you better ask it me.
Okay. What legal support in the law or what linguistic support in the tariff is there for EAL's characterization of the green blob as unrecovered?
I think you're trying to make this a little bit more simple than it is. You have to take the tariff in its entirety and the law in its entirety.
Is there anything in the law or the tariff that supports the characterization of that green blob as unrecovered? Please answer the question. Give me a break. She said she doesn't even know if she's answered it because she doesn't understand the question, and then I've asked it 3 times and she won't answer it.
Why is your view that it's unrecovered?
He's asking me for a specific dollar amount.
No.
And
Well, yeah, sure I am. You're characterizing that green blob as unrecovered. That's what the he says, right?
that's correct.
Okay. What is the legal support for that characterization?
All right, this one I'm objecting then to, legal issues can be addressed in
All these involve a mix of roles. Applying the tariff, she has to have an understanding. Her answer will go to that understanding and won't be seen as a legal concession or a stated legal position on the part of the company without conflict of attorneys. Not from the part of the tariff.
Should I ask the question again? Okay, what legal support is there for the characterization of that green chunk as unrecovered?
Mr. Tinsley, there is nothing specific in the law that says the 59, 213, 257 is unrecovered. But we have to look at the tariff and the law in its entirety in order to understand how the tariff works.
Okay, so what's in the tariff that characterizes that as unrecovered?
Now, if she goes to Schedule A, you're stuck with it, okay?
That's fine, but I think she's already said that Schedule A doesn't say you don't recover line 9. So what's in Schedule A that supports that characterization? Answer the question. It's the same as your last answer. Is there anything in the tariff that supports your characterization of that amount as unrecovered?
Let her answer.
Is there anything, the question is there anything in the tariff that says that is unrecovered?
Yes, ma'am.
Again, there's nothing in the tariff specifically that says 69 million.
Conference recording has stopped.
Wonderful time.
What does that mean?
Sometimes yes, sometimes that's. There's usually an expiration. We need to take a break, make sure, and call in order to what extent the line is being included for record purposes.
No.
Yeah, we have to have a recording pursuant to the statute to require.
It's showing us recording. It says it's recording.
Your answer was interrupted.
Okay, would you like me to start over?
If you would like to.
I think it would be helpful.
Your Honor, if we could actually do this, I think the court reporter got it. And she could just read it back. Or we could at least ask her.
Well, but she did, she stopped.
Yeah.
So if we have the court reporter read it back, then she can continue from that point if she wants to.
That's acceptable, Your Honor.
If you could read back, last.
This conference is being recorded. Only the main conference is recorded.
You know, I'm gonna have to build up.
The answer that I have is, again, there's nothing in the tariff specifically that says 69,213,000.
So is that your
Would
answer?
add to that or
Yes, I
stop?
would like to add
Okay,
to it.
please do that.
There's nothing in the tariff that specifically refers to that amount of money that I just stated. And Mr. Tinsley is trying to make something very, very simple. It's not overly complicated, it's simplifying it more than it needs to be.
Couldn't it be said that EAL is trying to take something simple and make it more complicated?
When you say that, I'm
Yes.
trying to,
And we are saying that, aren't we? So is there anything in the tariff that supports the characterization of any amount of money that's the ROE band rate as unrecoverable?
well, there's a cap. There's a cap constraint. And so if you're in a year when you are, the net change in revenue is greater than the cap constraint, then yes, the tariff specifically says that that amount is unrecovered, is unrecoverable and is unrecoverable.
Well, it says the amount that's above the cap, right?
That's what I would recommend.
Okay, but that does not mean that we can identify the amount above the cap as anything other than some portion of the sum of lines 9 and 10 on attachment A2, right?
You have to be able to distinguish of the revenues that is collected, what those revenues cover.
Okay, let's go back to A2, all right? The cap is applied to the sum of lines 9 and 10, right?
Yes, I believe that if we have the A2 that directly corresponds to the situation that is in my hearing or in the executive, we have, I think that it's,
Okay,
a little bit.
I'm just talking to your attorneys can redirect you. If you want that opportunity, I'm sure they're taking notes and they're probably gonna ask you about it. But just to be clear, the cap is applied to line 11, right?
The cap constraint is compared to line 11.
Okay. And line 11 is the sum of lines 9 and 10.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything in this document that says you can determine what's below the cap and what's above the cap in terms of segregating lines 9 and 10? Look down here at the notes. Is there anything in those notes that says that?
No, there's nothing specific in that note, but if you'll notice, the rates that are calculated, the 20% includes the current year change in revenues, and it also includes the annualized filing total revenues there on line 18, line 15. So you have to make a distinction of what the revenues collected were attributable to.
Who has to make that distinction? Why do you have to make that distinction? Does the law say you have to do that?
Objection, 3 questions, and 1 call for legal.
And interrupted again.
Your Honor, do we have the one lawyer rule in effect?
Well, there was more than one occasion began talking before she had stopped, and it wasn't about the objection to her responsiveness.
That's fine, Your Honor. I'll endeavor not to interrupt you. Let me ask you again. Does
All
the,
that question is, are you?
does the law say you have to do what you just said?
There's a qualification that this won't be taken as a legal position, interview with the lawyers, because of your understanding of the application that caused you to do what you did, please state it.
The understanding that I have for the way that we do it is, are looking at the tariff in totality, to see the different pieces that are brought in. You have to be able to look at the revenue that you collected and recognize that part of it is coming, it could be made up of three pieces. It could be made up of the annualized value revenue, which is basically that revenue you're already collecting, and then the net change for the current year, the following year that you're making, can be made up of two parts, both the netting adjustment and the ROE band with adjustment for the projected year. If you don't make those distinctions, then the entire tariff doesn't work. The law says there has to be a netting adjustment, it has to be included in the rate. So the law doesn't specifically say split it so that you can make that distinction, but in order to make the tariff work, from my standpoint as a non-lawyer, if I need to make the tariff work, then I need to understand what revenues that were generated, what was the genesis of those revenues.
All right. There's always going to be a netting adjustment because we're always going to have line 10 on attachment A2, right?
It's not showing that, it's stuff in.
You need to see it. Don't you remember line 10? Yeah, I'm happy to show it to you. But we're not proposing any change to attachment A2, are we?
We can take it into.
Yeah, or staff. We're always going to have attachment D6, right?
We're going to have to take part of it.
Okay, and then that number is always going to be reflected on line 10 of attachment A2, right? So how do we not have a netting adjustment? It's just a question of how you do it, right? Not a question of whether you do it. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that was a series of questions thrown together.
I think it's one question. It's not about how you do it. It's not about whether you do it. It's about how you do it, right?
I think that's about.
Did you understand the question? You need to repeat it.
The dispute at issue is not about whether to do a netting adjustment. It's about how to do the netting adjustment. Isn't that true?
That is a dispute, but it's my view that the methodology that staff and AEC has proposed allows you to make the netting adjustment, but then you ignore it. You don't assume that any revenues that you collected in the projected year are applied to the netting adjustment.
How do you ignore it if you're reporting it on line 10?
It's in line 10, but then in between the next year, when you look at the revenues that you brought in, if you do not recognize that a portion of those revenues apply to the netting adjustment, then you've ignored it. To kind of explain it a little further, if I, in this very same, I'm sorry, can you use that method, please?
Sure.
So in this particular situation here, on line 9, the ROE adjustment is 44 million. The netting adjustment is 23 million, so the total net change in revenues is 68 million. Now, I believe what Mr. Kinsley, the AEC and the staff position is that when you collect revenues in the projected year, and you look at the actual revenues, you have to apply all of those revenues to your projected, or to your netting adjustment for what, at that point, was your projected year. So my question would be, if I'm gonna put a netting adjustment on line 10 that doesn't have anything to do with the ROE band adjustment that's calculated on the projected year, I'm gonna collect those revenues, but I'm only gonna apply it to the projected ROE band adjustment. Why would I even need to collect the $23 million? If I'm going to true up money, true up the projected year, assuming all things are equal, and the projections was equal to the historic, the historic was equal to the projections, and didn't make any changes, I would have over collected $23 million. So if you don't recognize that part of those, yeah, I just lost the thing also. So if I can't distinguish part of the revenues that come in actuality were used to satisfy the netting adjustment, then why would I even collect them? I'm gonna automatically assign $68 million to a netting adjustment for an ROE band adjustment that was projected at 44. I'm automatically gonna over collect.
All right. Bottom line is, nothing we have said alters attachment A2, does it?
No.
And nothing we have said,
Nothing, and the company is not.
and nothing we have said alters attachment D6, does it?
No.
So that's always gonna be in the tariff, right?
Yes, it's gonna be in the tariff, but why would we want to collect more money than you? Why would you
Ms. Tompkins,
design a tariff to over collect money you have to?
I'm asking the questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let's look at some attachment D6s. Is that attachment D6 for the historical year 2017?
Yes, it is attachment D6 for the historical year 2017.
And this was filed by the company in 2018?
Yes, it would have been filed in 2018.
Okay. Now, this dispute is about line 12, right? What's the appropriate amount to report on line 12, right? So in this year, Entergy reported almost $51 million on line 12, right? And that's the amount of money that Entergy collected through the rider in the historic year, right?
The amount of money the company collected, sent it to the rates, put it into effect in 2017.
Okay. And those rates were based on attachment A2, right?
Yes, the rates that were put into effect in 2017, that's based on the attachment A2 filed in 2016.
Right. And so here's the number, 51 million. That's what it says, right? That's a long way from zero, isn't it?
It is not zero.
It's a heck of a lot higher than zero, right?
It is not zero.
And yeah, darn sure it's not, right? And there's a reference there to note 3. Okay, I'm going to read note 3. You tell me if I read it right. Adjusted historical year rider FRP, or adjusted historical year FRP rider revenue is the total FRP rider revenue received for the historical year. Did I read that right?
Yes,
So that's all it says about how you report what's on line 12, right?
that's the footnote.
There's not any more sentences than what I read, right? Okay, is there anything else in this document that addresses line 12? Where does this document say that you get to report no revenue because you decided that your band rate adjustment was above the cap? Where does it say that? Does it say that?
I don't understand where the cap comes into play here.
Well, isn't it your position that you can report 0 on this year's line 12 because the band rate adjustment for 2019 was above the cap? That's your position, right?
No, that's not my position.
What's your position?
My position is that we recorded $50,901,348 for that year.
I'm talking about this year, Ms. Watkins. Well, we'll get there. Okay, we'll get there. But that year, you reported $51 million in that line, right?
Yes, and again, you have to go back to the A2 from the filing year 2016 to see what was in the rates that was designed to collect that amount.
Just for clarity of record, the 51 million is exactly 50,901,348. That's your reference to 51 million.
Yes, you're right. Okay, let's look at another. This is the attachment D6 for the historical year 18, right?
Yes, it is.
On line 12, the company reported $72.2 million in revenue this year, right?
Yes.
And for the record, that's $72,205,405, right? It's a whole lot more than 0, isn't it? And note 3 says what it says, right?
The adjusted historical year FRP rider revenue, total FRP rider revenue received for the historical year.
And that's what the last one said too. Last note 3 said the same thing, right?
Yes, no, it's not.
It's never changed, has it?
It's not.
So this is the attachment D6 for the historical year 2019, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And on line 12, Entergy reported 0. And note 3 says what it says. It's never changed.
Nothing.
It doesn't say that you get to adjust that number based on some determination that there was some unrecovered money, does it?
The premise that the company based the fact that there is 0 on it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that there was unrecovered money. What we are trying to explain is that, again, the rates that went into effect for 2019 included 3 pieces of revenue: the bandwidth adjustment, the netting adjustment, and the ongoing cumulative amount. There was a cap constraint in that filing, which meant that the cap, if you look at the numbers, and again, you won't report that A2, but if you look at the numbers, the cap constraint completely involves just the netting adjustment. So you have to recognize that the netting adjustment is part, if not all, of the money that we receive. Company's position is that the netting adjustment, the money that we received in 2019 covers the netting adjustment, and there was no money received to go toward the ROE adjustment for 2017. If you look at if you assume that none of that revenue that was collected goes towards the netting adjustment, then I'll go back to my earlier statement, the netting adjustment is mute. Why do we need to include it if none of the revenue that you collect is attributed to the netting adjustment?
Isn't it true that the company's position is premised on the notion that the 2019 ROE band rate adjustment was unrecoverable?
Yes, we are saying that the revenue that we collected in 2019 satisfied the 2017 netting adjustment that was approved to be collected in 2019, and there was no dollars above that that we could collect because of the cap calculation.
Okay, so
That
where
could
does,
be attributed to the 2019 netting adjustment.
where does note 3 contemplate that?
I'm showing on the screen that it's trying to adapt to Zoom. I don't know why it's not. Okay. Can you see me?
I'm sharing the screen. I can stop it. It appears to be working for me.
Okay, as long as you can hear me and see me, then I don't need to see myself. I think it's cut off. Let's see. It's getting, saying it's trying to connect.
Here we are.
Okay.
Now, we need to think back about
Yeah, we're still in walk-off.
I'm doing that.
Yeah.
All right. Where does note 3 say you get to make that determination?
The sentence that is covered is most in on the same time, so that.
twice.
Yeah. My train of thought is,
The determination I'm referencing is the determination that there was an amount above the cap that represents the 2019 band rate adjustment that was unrecovered. Where does note 3 say you get to decide that?
note 3 says the adjusted, not actual, historical year FRP revenue is the total FRP rider revenue received for, not in, but for the historical year. It is the company's position that based on the A2 that laid out the rates that were billed in 2019, that none of those revenues associated with the 2019 bandwidth calculation was included in that rate because of the cap constraint.
Does
The
note
amount
3,
that we collected is only pursuant to the netting adjustment.
does note 3 refer to the 2017 historical year?
It doesn't refer to any particular year.
It refers to the historical year, right?
It says received for the historical year, not in the historical year.
And at the top it says for the historical year 2019, doesn't it? Okay, does this say 2017 anywhere on it? Does 2017 appear on the document? Okay, so the historical year referenced in note 3 is obviously 2019, isn't it?
Rider, FRP revenue, or FRP rider revenue received for the historical year. The historical year is filed in 2019.
Okay. But you want to read that to say rider revenue received for the 2017 historical year or something, don't you?
Well, I think we just need to go back to what I said earlier, that if you assume that all of the revenue that you collect in a given year, even though it was made up of a netting adjustment and a bandwidth adjustment, if you assume that none of that revenue was associated with the netting adjustment, it means that the netting adjustment is not necessary. Why would the tariff, excuse me, I'm not asking a question, but it doesn't make sense to me why we would include a netting adjustment calculation, because this is part of an expensive calculation. And the law, if we go back to the law says that the rates, if the company chooses a projected year, then the rates have to include an amount for the netting adjustment. If the rates include an amount for the netting adjustment, and you discount that and say that none of the revenue that you received is for the netting adjustment, then the netting adjustment doesn't have any meaning, it's just a calculation. And I believe that over the years of the FRP, and I've been involved in every one since the inception of the EAL FRP, there's been a lot of controversy between the difference between projected and netting. It didn't matter to what we billed and the revenue that we received, then why would you care what the difference between the projected and the netting amount is?
Your Honor, can you admonish the witness to just answer my questions? Because she's made an argument about how we do the netting adjustment reportedly about 3 times now, and I'm not asking questions about that. I think that's inherent.
Ask her how she did it to explain why she calculated that.
I asked her if there's anything in note 3 that supports that. And I think she said no, and then she went on a diatribe again about her policy argument that the company has asserted numerous times. So I just need her to answer the questions.
Please answer the question again if you have explanation.
Are you familiar with the testimony filed
Chairman?
by Ms. Lindholm?
Can we hold, we may have somebody offline. Hold on. Just give him a minute. He's on. Yeah, yeah.
Or you can all
Kick me out.
Okay.
No, it just completely kicked me out of Zoom. Nope, now it's trying to fix that.
and you're trying to connect that to
It is trying.
Okay, I'm back. You good?
and are you back as well? And is this the gentleman that had the problem? Okay, so right back.
Yes, sir.
Proceed, Mr.
Are you familiar with the direct testimony filed by Ms. Lindholm?
Yes.
Ms. Lindholm characterizes Entergy's filing as unique this year on page 4 of her direct testimony. I'll read that to you, okay? She says, "This is the first year that EAL has filed an evaluation report that includes a netting adjustment that looks back to a projected test year that included a netting adjustment in the Rider FRP annual file." Did I read that correctly?
I'm sorry. What line are you on?
Page 4, lines 3 through 5.
Yes.
Do you agree?
Do I agree to this one on statement?
Yeah. This is the first year that EAL has filed an evaluation report that includes a netting adjustment that looks back to a projected test year that included a netting adjustment in the Rider FRP annual file. Do you agree with that? Are you familiar with exhibit VLC2? EAL's direct exhibit VLC2?
Part of the
Correct. You are familiar with it?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I've looked at it. I know it's filed. I couldn't tell you anything on it right now without
Sure.
looking at it.
I'm going to show it to you.
Please
I'm so sorry, yes,
Your mic, or move your mic.
I'm so sorry.
Okay. So let's look at direct exhibit VLC two. Do you see that?
Would it be possible for you to pull that up?
Yeah.
Very-
I'll try. It is fine. Is that better?
You want more time?
Mhm.
Perfect.
Is that exhibit VLC two?
Sorry. Yes, EAI direct exhibit, EAL direct exhibit, DLC two.
And this is showing sort of a comparison for the historical year of 2019, right? It's showing significant drivers for the differences.
It's showing the differences between the projected year and the historical year.
Right, so it's sort of what you would look at when you're looking at a netting adjustment, right?
It's designed to show the drivers of the changes between the historical year and the
Yeah, but you're looking
projected
at,
amount that was filed versus the historical actual amount.
so you're looking at the 2019 PY and the 2019 AY, HY, right?
That's right.
Yeah, let's go into this now. Line 27. What does that say?
Line 27 says the amount not received because of cap insurance.
Okay. Did that appear on a correlative exhibit in any prior inter-GFRP filing?
I'm sorry, it's 40 here.
Line 27. This document, BLC2, this is something you guys file when we're doing a netting adjustment every year, right?
Yeah.
Did the last one have a line 27?
For the historical year 2018, to be honest, I don't really know what I have to look at it.
Okay. But this, line 27, is premised on the company's assertion that the $69 million, which I think you changed that number, you may not have the number you changed, but the PY increase was not received, correct?
That's correct. We're showing the change between the revenue requirement, the total revenue requirement, not the amount that was received, the total revenue requirement in the projected year 2019 to the historical year 2019.
Sorry.
I'm connected again. I'll continue, and if there's an issue, I don't like looking at myself anyway, so.
You need the document up anyway?
Oh, can the people on Zoom, they should.
I think they can
They
hear
couldn't
you.
even pause. but they-
Huh.
Is everybody back up? See if everybody's back up on.
Let's talk.
Okay, now.
All right. So again, line 27 is again based on the notion that some amount of money for the 2019 increase was unrecovered, correct?
Yeah, the DLC2 is designed to show the change between the total revenue requirement from the projected year to the historic year. The total revenue requirement is the amount that the total revenue requirement is the amount based on the company earning its allowed return. And so it assumes that full revenue requirement assumes we were able to collect everything that we needed. So in order to take the difference, or to explain the difference between the projected amount during your requirement and the historical, you have to recognize that you did not receive all of the money that you needed in the projected. It's a reconciling item.
Okay, and that assertion that you just made is based on what tariff language?
DLC two is not a tariff, it's an explanation.
but
It's
you
strictly it's used to help explain why the projected test year is different from the historical. That's all DLC does. It shows how we got from projected revenue requirement to the actual historical revenue requirement.
Okay, what language in the law can you cite as support for line 27?
The law doesn't require DLC two. It was something that was developed that the parties appreciated, as I understand it, and asked us to file every year. On the basis in the law, it was part of the ongoing discussion that we have had with all the parties through the years to make the FRP filing more understandable.
So your answer is that line 27 has no basis in the law, is that right?
I'm saying that the entire schedule has no basis in the law.
Fair enough. What language in the tariff can you cite as support for line 27?
Again, it's not a tariff requirement, it's something that we agreed upon to explain the difference between the projected year revenue requirement as compared to the historical revenue requirement.
Okay.
There are a lot of numbers on that schedule that don't show up in the tariff. The law specifically doesn't. That's right.
So we started out talking about how you assert that Entergy is entitled to a netting adjustment, right?
I'm saying that the law at 725 specifically states that if a company chooses a projected test year, the basis for its FRC, then the netting adjustment has to be calculated, and that netting adjustment has to be included in the rate that are billed.
Do you agree that the ratepayers are entitled to a netting adjustment?
Absolutely, the netting adjustment goes both ways.
Yeah.
Over recovery, we have to refund the money. Under recovery, we can collect money.
And in fact, the netting adjustment is part of the ratepayer protections built into the tariff. Would you agree?
It is.
I'm going to show you your hearing exhibit again. Instead of looking at 18, I want to look at 2020. Up there in the top right corner, it says 80,027. And it also says that above the green band. What is that number?
There's a line missing on both of those, the 80,027. If you see on the column, the all green, March 2021 projected year ROE band, the 80,000 represents the fact that the small general service class was over its cap. In total, the amount that the company is asking for, 68 million, was under the cap of 70, a little over 72 million. But the law specifically says that the cap is based on each classes. And so the small general service class was $80,000 over its cap, so that's the amount that we reduced the ask for because it exceeded the cap.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And to be, to add help clarity, when you see the green box, there's a very thin line above there.
That
Is that
represents,
a line that represents 80,000?
it does, and there's,
It's just so small that it's hard to see.
it's so small, since the key on the left is in 10,000, 10 million increments, 80,000 doesn't hardly show up, so.
And so on
And then
column, the far right, you have the same thing on top of the blue line.
it is the same thing on top of the blue box, and, I apologize, there was a line, in the original, there was a line that went from the 80,000 down to that very thin green line that is the copy that just didn't.
But you can see on the key, that's labeled ROE band unrecovered, right?
That's right, not over the cap, but we can't recover.
And that's comparable to the green box on this one, right?
It is,
Okay, at least in the companies, correct?
that's correct.
Did you receive the hearing exhibit that summarizes the two methodologies for the life of the FRP that AEC circulated? I'll show it to you.
Yes, that would be helpful.
Previously circulated hearings,
Yes, Your Honor, this is a hearing exhibit that we circulated before. Well, I should say this. We noticed a couple typos late last night. We circulated a new copy. This is the corrected copy. I'm happy to use the old copy that was circulated prior to the deadline, but I actually think it'll be more helpful if we can use the corrected copy. It was circulated pursuant to the procedural schedule yesterday. You recognize that, Ms. Talkington?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so, just to be clear, this presents the 2017 netting adjustment and the 2018 netting adjustment on the first page, is that right?
That's what it indicates, yes. Those words are on there.
And, I mean, obviously, you can agree, subject to check, that those numbers are accurate.
All of the numbers are accurate. Mr. Tinsley, I did receive this. It was I believe it was a PDF. I have not verified any of the numbers. I can't speak to how the numbers flow. I can't speak to the correctness of the numbers. I can look at it and verify that there are numbers on there.
Sure. I mean, did the numbers appear accurate to you for 18 and 19 here?
Again, I can look at it, I can compare it, I don't know where the numbers came from, and I can't draw any conclusions from.
Do you recall back in 2017, the commission approving a rate increase of approximately $66.7 million for the company through our FRP?
Yes, I believe that's close.
So, approximately $10.1 million, is that correct?
There are a lot of numbers, and we've made 5 columns, and so right now, looking at this schedule, and this is a couple of slides, I can't verify any of these numbers.
Okay. So the top one on the second page, 2020, that's what we're looking at this year, right?
We are looking, you are discussing the 2020 valuation report here.
And we're looking at the 2019 netting adjustment, correct?
That's correct.
You agree that the top left column there sets forth Entergy's methodology with regard to this issue accurately?
As I stated, the numbers are familiar. I was not able to look at the spreadsheet where this came from. the logic that went into producing this schedule.
At the beginning of your testimony, you made some corrections, right?
Yes, I did.
And the number that you corrected was 67,427, right?
Yeah.
That's the number that,
Just, you said invert and said thousand, 67 million.
I'm sorry, you're right. That's the number that appears on line 5, is it not?
Yes, that's the number on my side.
And you're agreeing that that's the amount of money that Entergy actually collected through the writer's operation in the historic year, correct?
That's correct.
So you're not prepared to assess the accuracy of these columns? Okay. Well, let's just drop down to the bottom. You see line 28,
Yes, I do.
and that presents the total recovery from 2020 to 2022 for the competing methodologies. Do you see that?
The numbers online.
Okay. If Ms. LeConte's calculations are correct, the company's methodology would result in the company collecting approximately $45 million more than it would collect under Ms. LeConte's methodology. Isn't that what the schedule purports to show?
I would know what the schedule supposed to show and compare this system.
Okay. Do those numbers sound accurate?
And I was not able to follow it the way we were given it. I could not verify that the 169 is correct or the 125 is correct.
Has the company attempted to calculate the amount that it would recover for the next 3 years under its methodology?
For the next 3 years,
Yeah, from 2020 to 2022.
not officially, we
Well, unofficially, have you all done that?
I guess. Can you give me a little background? What are you asking?
Has the company attempted to map out what its methodology will do to ratepayers for the remaining life of the FRP?
Is not calculated, that I'm aware of, the total recovery amount for 2023, 2022. No, I don't know that I'll just get that number. I've not seen a number that's proposed to.
So you can't sit here and provide any feedback about the accuracy of Ms. LeConte's estimates.
No.
Do you have any reason to think that they're not accurate?
I have no reason to think they're not. I have no reason to think that they are.
Okay. If her assumptions are correct, EAL's methodology will result in the collection of $170 million over those 3 years. Is that what the schedule purports to show?
And Ms. LaHonda, if that's what she's purporting that it shows, then I have no way, I don't have any reason to doubt her, but I can't verify that that number is correct or that that is actuality what it is.
Okay, so the company has made a big stink about how our methodology is going to hurt ratepayers next year, right?
What's your interpretation of that question?
The company is asserting that our methodology will harm ratepayers next year, did it not?
The company ensures that if we follow the same methodology that is being proposed for this year, that the customers will miss out on $47 million refunded due to the.
Okay. So the company has looked ahead to next year, has it not?
Yes,
But you have not looked ahead to the final netting adjustment in 2022?
no, I have not.
How can you say that our methodology will harm ratepayers in the long term without engaging in that cumulative analysis?
I don't believe the testimony of the customer in the long term. statement was for the 2018 true up, which was a credit, will be a credit, that we will be it will be easier to get there and be very quickly. Those numbers,
Let me ask you this. Isn't your assertion about next year disingenuous if you have not attempted to game this out over the remaining life of the FRP?
you know,
Don't we need to know which methodology is going to benefit ratepayers in the long term?
I don't think the goal is to present the actual calculation.
Isn't
Whether
the
it
goal,
benefits the company, whether it benefits the ratepayers, the FRP is designed, and the netting adjustment is designed to benefit, well, to refund an over recovery or allow the company to collect an under recovery. It's the goal, it's not the company's intention to say, we want to benefit the company, so let's make the numbers benefit the company. The calculation determines what the rates need to be, subject to the commissioner's approval.
but you're arguing that we're going to harm ratepayers, but you haven't done the complete analysis to determine that in the long term. Isn't that what you said?
I don't have to do the analysis all the way out to 2022 to understand that if there's a credit that's being included in the netting adjustment, and I have to not assume that any of that netting adjustment went forward that I collected or gave back relates to those dollars. It only relates to the projected netting adjustment. Then yes, I am shorting the customer by $47 million in the netting adjustment. And in fact, the $11 million is made up of a negative number of netting adjustment, positive number ROE band adjustment. We're going to assign the credit to the older netting adjustment, and instead of $10 million being on the netting adjustment for 2020, $57 million will be on that. Yes.
Okay. Many of the same ratepayers who pay rates next year are also going to pay rates the following year, right?
I would assume so.
If you hand me $5 in one hand and you take $10 in the other, what's my net?
Okay. Negative $5.
Okay, right? So if you're taking 40-some million dollars from ratepayers this year and you're giving them back to them next year, that just offsets, doesn't it?
Is timing different?
Sure. But then if you take even more money the year after that, ratepayers are hurt, aren't they?
Not necessarily. You're assuming that just because the rates went up, ratepayers are hurt. The FRP is designed to allow the company to collect its currently incurred cost.
Does it matter that we're losing a credit next year if the rate increases driven by your methodology are vastly higher than that credit?
I don't understand the question.
Why should ratepayers care if in the end they come out $45 million ahead?
I believe in our situation, they are coming out as getting the benefit of the $47 million over recovery.
But you haven't looked at all 3 years together. We've already agreed with that, right?
But I know that there's $47 million that will be returned to customers.
If you take 45 million extra dollars from me this year, and you give me $47 million next year, what did I net?
Over the 2 years, I mean, it's obvious, positive 47 and a negative 47 equals 0. But again, I think it's a little simplistic to just assume that that's the correct way to do it because it nets to 0. We need to be able to follow the dollars so that each year, something that's been said many times, that each year stands on its own. You have to calculate each year's netting adjustment, account for the dollars for each year. And by just saying, well, you're gonna get it, just netting all the dollars without regard to how they were calculated or where they were derived from, I think is a little,
Aren't we supposed to be following the tariff?
I believe I am following the.
But you've already agreed that the tariff does not support your characterization of a 0 in attachment D6, line 12, correct?
I didn't say that.
All right.
You asked me if that 0 was on there, and
Yeah, and I asked you, where does it say in note 3 that you get to decide to put a 0 there? And you said it doesn't say that, didn't you? Okay.
But
So the
I also
tariff
said that
is-
You can't just look at it in isolation and draw a conclusion.
Right.
You have to look at the tariff and the totality,
The tariff's approved by the commission, right?
in a certain way.
And it says what it says. Do you agree with that? And you gotta follow what the tariff says. Do you agree with that?
I believe that the tariff does not specifically outline every single step that's needed to calculate the FRP. There are several steps that we, as a company and parties have agreed by accepting it, that because of the way the tariff calculations work, we have to do, even though the tariff does not specifically say that this number is here.
But note 3 says what's supposed to be on that line, doesn't it? Note 3 to
You've already
attachment
discussed
D6.
that you read that tariff, that line to me, and I agree that that's what it said on the tariff.
We've reached a conclusion on convenience, right?
We can take a break, Your Honor, it's fine.
Now we get time for a break. Come back in 15.
Well, we be doing by then. I don't know what time they take lunch.
I think, Your Honor, I could be done by noon and then we could take lunch.
And I think it's the wireless mics. Can we turn the wireless mics off? That's on the.
Wireless mics, it's the wireless mics.
They're all around.
Your Honor, while we're deciding that, can I move to admit our hearing exhibit?
I have that, Commissioner, that maybe did it, Mr. Coffey, not verified. Anyway,
The rules of evidence don't apply in commission proceedings, Your Honor. I think that the authenticity of the document certainly can be established better. But at this point, I think admission into the record is going to be necessary for the parties to be able to interpret all of the foregoing cross-examination on the exhibit.
Or you suggest the evidence in terms of what the rating impact is?
No, Your Honor, I want it to be substantive evidence, and if I need to admit it through Ms. Latanti, I'll do that.
continue to check it out. Once it's got authentication, there's no evidence presented that validates any of the information in that reason.
The witness is not said it, does not identify as something she knows what it is.
I understand, Your Honor. I'll present it through Ms. Lewis. That's fine.
Conference recording has stopped.
I think we're having Wi-Fi trouble or something. The Zoom has stopped. It's frozen.
Yeah.
Go tell Just go mark it down. It's back on.
Well, we want to come back to lunch or is it not? Try 8:15, then you'll conclude and hopefully.
That's fine.
Yeah. And now, it's getting hard. Yeah. I think we turn on all the lights to that post. No, these are here. So all of them are on. Who's that? So I thought that, I mean, we've done it before for Sean.
No, I agree.
This. Why is that? Let's try it. So you gotta hold it down to turn it.
Sit there and hold the student on that. It's not like yours that turn on and off. Right?
Well, we're getting a lot back.
Yeah.
No, it usually doesn't do that at all. So that's why I thought it So it's something new that we're doing right now that's not. Yeah. See how you can hear them? So I don't know, that's why I was asking them maybe turn off the lights out there. Wireless.
What's the difference? I was talking to somebody else yesterday.
We can try.
Does it make any better?
I can can hear their conversation.
Do we want to turn off all our wireless mics?
Yeah, I've got them all turned off. That's clear. No. Is that, hey, how's it going, man? I'm doing good. Thank you.
It's off now.
Okay. It was
What did you
wireless. It was those wireless mics.
Okay,
So I just.
that's what I thought.
Thanks, Valerie.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Valerie, I really want to handle that. They don't have my, have their notes. Can you say something, and maybe you can come up to somewhere else?
Well, speak loud.
Because those were, can you turn them on?
They need to stay on.
Except are they turned off at the source or,
At the board.
At the board?
so if you turn them on, well,
And we gotta change some batteries also.
What time was the conversation? 55.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I figured we would until one takes off.
Yeah. Yeah, I gave it to
Um,
him. I gave it to him, he said it was gonna be.
I mean,
Do I really have to
I don't
answer this?
think, I don't think any of us want to be here, late into the evening, but is there anything?
No, I don't have anything that would, that.
Yeah.
well, that's based on, no, we didn't.
You never know what we're.
Yeah.
I know, I saw your suit, very nice. Yeah, very nice, good job. I know, right? You need to do something virtual.
Fits with the field.
Yeah, and it's good.
The room has an older field.
The chair.
I like this, I was telling you, I said, this is a good test to have young.
Oh, yeah.
We can take that proposal here, sounds like, right, it's like, at the bottom, now that we're doing this, especially what we know. Here's something that's not.
Well, here, and this is suggestion I was gonna send after the hearing is done, but instead of doing that on the laptop, we can just do it. We have the little mobile webcam.
Yeah.
Or we can-
Well, that's already built in, we already had cameras.
Well, I'm not talking about the mounted one, I'm just saying something that we can do in December instead of that.
Yeah.
It's like $30 or $40, you can sit there, so you can have a good view of us, you can sit one here of having, and so you don't have to try to do that, and people are looking from a long distance. So they're like $30. You just sit right here and sit one out there.
Well, we just do, even just one for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got fuller.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, hey, Commissioner.
Okay, good, okay, we'll get that going.
And there is, information that will promote consulting others, I think that's thank you. I got the link and so before. You don't have to make that.
We'll roll with it.
So did he say lunch for 5 minutes? Yeah. Yeah, so if you push it all the way forward, it locks it. So it looks like this thing will go on.
I know, but you gotta be like, that last long.
Especially when you have all this stuff.
God, we use this so often, I know how to do this daggone thing, and all of a sudden I couldn't get it working. I don't have enough recordings, this probably won't matter.
Oh, perfect. Okay. That'll be great. Thank you.
Nothing like this, I'm not doing it. I changed batteries.
I have no idea what that is. I'll get back to that.
Bill knows.
Okay, we're good.
I said, well, maybe the rest of it.
I gotta show it there.
People.
Yeah.
The issues. She said that maybe, she said that I work those things, other people from outside. They're tuning my network. To get the free Wi-Fi, but she says that one, she goes ahead and do everything.
Yeah.
And go with the machine on her.
Right. So I don't know.
Some people are using.
Well, they might be watching on their laptop and communicating on their phone.
I purposely did myself out because I was listening to it on YouTube, make sure there's no distortion.
Yeah.
Sounds okay. Oh, that.
Surviving.
Huh. Well, Bill said he thought it, when he turned off all the wireless mics,
Yeah, I noticed.
that it solved it. What's this one? Check the batteries 3 times. I just put, unless they're dead, I just put brand new ones in. I hadn't used this in about 8 months, but last time I used it, all I had to do was hold it down.
I have that battery. Batteries are good.
Yeah, I've been looking for one of those in the store to buy to test my batteries at home. Yeah, those are hard to find.
Yes, they are.
You used to couldn't find
I
those.
know.
Because I remember my dad used to have one.
I can like test the 9-volt battery, but I don't know.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, I'll let you go get started.
I'll be right back with the battery tester.
Okay. Yeah, I've got 2 more batteries, but they both come out the same pack.
Surgery always goes correct.
Yeah, you are. They won't, because it's not up.
Yes.
I mean, really.
Peter Paul?
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for all
But,
this.
you know,
No, thank you.
Okay. Yes. Okay, hold on.
Good catch, but I think.
Okay. Yes, ma'am, he's on the way back there. He's gonna stop there. No. That's good. Use your mind. Yeah. I'll make sure you get one of the good ones. That makes sense. I'll put my little logo filter up to
I thought y'all were all about it. Usually.
I'm happy to visit you and her and go back over my notes, because I'm just trying to write down what I'm actually asking about.
Okay, thank you.
The stuff that I'm referring to, that's set for, like, building is in the record, right? So anything that's kind of.
Yeah, it's in the record.
I've already been to the
Okay, well, we'll do that. Well, they're not.
Matt?
Yes, ma'am. Got it. Got it. And I'm happy to follow up with you. So we need to try to figure out this out. We will cooperate in that process.
So they will do it.
What's what, and record, of course, you have to know exactly.
Got it. I think thus far, with that one exception, what Trevor is.
Yeah.
And now he's
I'll tell you what, this is the way.
I realize what you did.
I
do that testimony all the time, I'm like pacing up, and then you sit back to me like, oh God, that's so embarrassing.
Well, then people are going to read.
But some of that does email.
Okay, all right.
All right, so we're ready.
Are you not supposed to make her for the close to
And you take notes about names, because the postal staff, we need to be sure to signal the record. People are in, so they know, and you take a note and say, this is the ABC.
We haven't,
Yeah, and I would. So at one point, we'll change out the batteries. Well, no, because they're not.
This conference is being recorded. Only the main conference is recorded.
When you turn it back.
Yeah, I I see Ms. Talkington in the Zoom. Are we good to go? And I'd like to turn your attention to some data request responses. Are you going to be familiar with Entergy's responses to data requests in this matter?
Yes, everyone has feelings.
Yes, I plan to show them to you. Okay, I'm gonna refer to this as AEEC Hearing Exhibit 1, since data requests are not in the record. But have you seen this before, Ms. Talkington?
Yes.
Can you identify it?
It's question number APEC 19-1.
And down below that, is it Entergy's response? And so this is a discovery interrogatory that was asked and answered in the course of these proceedings? Is that correct?
That's what it appears to be. I can't verify that this is exactly the one that was filed.
Well, subject to a check, will you agree that that's what it is?
Yes.
I would move to admit AEDC Hearing Exhibit 1 as a substantive exhibit.
You can do your cross, and like the exhibit to reflect whatever points you bring out, if there's something in there, whether you can discuss.
I plan to inquire about it. So Ms. Talkington, I'm going to read the question that AEDC directed to Entergy, and then I'm going to read a portion of Entergy's response, and then I have some questions for you. So please follow along while I read the question. EAL's projected FRP revenue adjustments exceeded the 4% cap in its 2017 and 2018 FRP filings and are projected to exceed the 4% cap in its 2020 FRP filing. Please provide the amount of capital additions and depreciation expense for each year that EAL exceeded, parentheses, or may exceed, close parentheses, the 4% cap that were not included in the revenue adjustment. Please provide an Excel format with all formulas and links intact. Did I read that right?
Yes, sir.
And then I'm going to read the second paragraph of Entergy's response. Each projected FRP revenue adjustment is composed of capital additions, depreciation expense, operation and maintenance expense, taxes, etc. As such, the company does not, parentheses, nor could not, close parentheses, develop a list of which costs are ultimately recovered or not when the company exceeds the 4% cap. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, sir.
So, Entergy asserts in this data request response that it cannot identify specific projects or costs which are ultimately recovered or not when there's a revenue increase above the cap. Is that what that says? Is that based on the idea that money is fungible? Well, in that paragraph, you list several different things where the company does, capital additions, depreciation expense, O&M, taxes, etc., correct? And then the data request asserts that the company is incapable of determining which costs are ultimately recovered or not. correct?
That's correct.
Is that because dollars are fungible?
I don't really know what you mean by fungible. What the response meant was that the revenue cap applies to the change in revenues. So if we have a change in revenues of $50 that is composed of all sorts of items in the revenue requirement, there's all sorts. It's just that the bottom line, in order to earn our return, our allowed return, we need an increase of $50. But I can only collect 40 of those dollars because of the cap. How can I assign specific expenses? There's no hierarchy of expenses where I can say this one was included, this one was not included. It's a total amount that is reduced, and it's a revenue adjustment, not an expense disallowance, if you will. It's the total revenue change was approved, we just are not allowed to collect the total revenue change because the cap comes into play.
But in this context, Entergy is more than willing to segregate the dollars which resulted from the 2017 netting adjustment and the 2019 ROE band rate adjustment. Do you agree?
I agree, but I think you're comparing apples to oranges.
Okay, and your attorneys can explore that with you. But in the context of determining which expenses are above the cap, the company has taken the position that that's impossible, correct?
Yes.
Do you agree that expenses are translated into dollars?
Change in revenue requirement, which is composed of a return on and a return of assets, rate base, and expenses, translated to revenue requirement change, which becomes a FRC rate bill.
On a dollar basis.
Yes, on a dollar basis.
And revenues are calculated on a dollar basis, right?
Yes.
If I have a bank account that's got 50 grand in it, and a client comes to me and says, hey, Jordan, I'm going to give you a retainer of $5,000. And I put that in the bank account with my 50 grand. And then that client comes back to me and says, I want my 5 grand back. You sorry dog, you're a bad lawyer. Can I give him that exact 5 grand back?
You can give him 5 grand back, that's not really.
Yeah, but I can't go back in the 55 grand and say, this is his 5 grand and this 50 was what was in here before, can I? Maybe if I was burying it in a hole in my yard, right, I could do that, but that's not what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, can you identify the exact dollars if they're all lumped together in a bank account?
Balance in there.
Right. All you know is that balance, right? You don't know which dollar belongs to the client and which belong to the clients that were already in there, right?
As soon as you put it in your bank account, it belongs to you.
Well, you may not know exactly how lawyers bill.
I
The
don't.
bottom line is, I can't give him his exact 5 grand back unless I went and buried it in my yard, right?
I guess not.
Okay. Did we already admit that one?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Well, that would be.
Let's look at another one.
The whole first of it is the content, the only 10-page document, you talk about 1 page, and then you argue later in the other on the 10th page, what we talked about. I know it's short enough that that would really possibly.
I don't think any of these are doing this, really. Okay, I got another one here, Ms. Talkington. Does this appear to be another data request response?
Yes.
And this is in fact Entergy's response to AEEC 18-1. Subject to check.
Yes.
You will agree that it is what it purports to be, subject to check? Now, I will move its admission as AEEC hearing exhibit 2.
Can I ask any questions about it?
Yes?
Would you like to admit about the last question?
Well, I don't think I can ask about it if it's not in the record, Kevin. I would like it admitted substantively.
Well, we'll get there. It's short, there's not a context problem. So we'll
Sure.
get there. And
All right.
there's nothing to do.
We'll handle this one the same way we did the last one. So I'll read you the question, and I'll ask you to agree if I read it correctly, and then I'll read you the response, or at least a portion of it, and ask you to agree that I read it correctly. Is that fair? The question is, regarding the EAL's response to AEEC 16-7, which we'll look at, provide the actual historical year's FRP revenue as required in attachment D6 line 12. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Response. No actual historical year's formula rate plan revenue was collected that should be reported on attachment D6 line 12. Did I read that sentence correctly? What tariff language did Entergy rely upon to assert that the revenue collected should not be reported?
Mr. Tinsley, I think this is the same question you asked me earlier, and as I stated earlier, there's no specific language in the tariff that says that, but you look at the tariff in its entirety and make sure that all of the tariff is handled as the calculations flow, the company made the determination that none of the revenue that we collected in 2019 was applicable for the historic 2019 year.
But you agree that there's nothing in the tariff that empowers the company to do that.
Can I ask an answer? In response to that? We just said before, we're on treatment.
I'll move on, Your Honor. So you keep referring to the tariff as a whole, but you will concede that there's no specific language in the tariff that supports the methodology. Is that correct?
That's my testimony.
Thank you. I'll move its admission as AEC hearing exhibit 2.
Okay.
You read it.
Okay, we've got another one. Is this EAL's response to AEEC interrogatory 16-7? And I'm going to refer to this as AEEC hearing exhibit 3. I'll read you the question. Question, please provide the actual FRP revenues that were recovered, and there was a word omitted, it should have said in, but it says that were recovered the 2020 historical year. Did I read that correctly? Response, CD attached, Entergy Arkansas LLC has provided the actual formula rate plan revenues for the 2020 italicized filing. Did I read that correctly? Now let's look at the attachment. Is that the correct attachment to 16-07? Okay. This shows the actual revenues collected through the writer's operation from January through June of 2020, correct? And the data request says that that is the actual formula rate plan revenues for the 2020 filing year, right?
Yes, because the 2020 historical year hasn't ended yet, so we don't really have a 2020 historical year.
I agree.
So we provided the revenues that have been collected pursuant to Rider FRP.
For the first 6 months of 2020, right? And this is just the money that customers paid pursuant to those percentage increases, right?
Yes, yes.
So next year, the number that you report on attachment D6, line 12, is certainly going to include the sum of these 6 months, right?
Now, it's not going to include all of the amount here. This is the total amount of FRP revenues that we're collecting. Go back to A2, you'll see that the rate collects the current year.
This is what the writer collected in the first 6 months of 20, correct?
Yes, but you asked me if it was going to show up on D6. Did
Yeah.
you not? And no, that total number is not going to show up on D6.
Okay. But it goes into that, won't it?
A portion of the revenues that are shown here will be shown on D6. The other portion of the revenues, or another portion of the revenues, will be included in the calculation of the earned return in the D6. To recognize that the revenues are made up of more than one piece.
Okay, but the data request says that these are the actual formula rate plan revenues for the 2025 year, doesn't it?
Yes, that's what it says.
Now let's go back to our attachment D6. Note 3. The total, note 3 says adjusted historical year FRP rider revenue is the total FRP rider revenue received for the historical year. Did I read that right? But your position is that even though the data request says you got 85 million through the rider through the first 6 months, that that's not going to show up on line 12 next year?
Not all of the revenues will show up on line 12. If we look at the A2 that was approved to collect the revenues in 2020, I can show you why not all of those revenues.
So why does this data request refer to that 85 million as the actual formula rate plan revenues?
Because we actually collected those pieces, all of those pieces of the revenue.
So you took that money from ratepayers and you put it in a bank, right? I'm sorry, I thought she was done.
This is not new. We're not doing anything new. Each year, the rider FRP percentage includes, it's a cumulative. So what we have collected in the past gets included in what gets included in the calculation of the earned return on D6. Because we're assuming we are already getting those revenues. The amount that goes on D6 line 12 is the amount of the revenues that we collected that were associated with the revenue change for the historic year. And so from the second year of 2018, when we were, again, it was a cumulative amount. We collected the amount that was approved in 2017. There was a change that was approved for 2018. Both of those pieces were collected that year. But the amount for 2017 was reported in attachment D3, I think it's line 2, to show that we included that in our historical calculation. The piece that goes down on D6 is the revenues that are associated with the revenue change that the company needed in order to apply in order to earn its allowed return. So the revenues that we reported from the beginning has always included those two pieces. The 85 is the amount that we collected in total by the rate that's on the bottom of A2, which again includes the cumulative piece plus the revenue change.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, what you have to report on line 12 is the incremental portion associated with last year's increase.
That's associated with, on B6, the 2020 revenues, the incremental portion that we're collecting in 2020 will show up on B6 in next year's filing when we have the netting adjustment for 2020.
Isn't that what I said? Okay, let's move on. This $85 billion, y'all aren't going and burying that in somebody's backyard, are you?
Couldn't argue that.
No, it's not. You're putting it in the bank, aren't you? Thanks. Okay. So you have called our attention to your testimony back in 2017, right?
Hearing testimony, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, your
Hearing
testimony
testimony?
at the hearing in 2017. You called our attention to that.
Yes.
And you assert that you told us all of this back then, right?
I asserted that we discussed it back then based on some questions that I received from Commissioner Thomas.
And it's your position that what you said back in 2017 was clear, that this is how the tariff would operate?
In my mind, yes.
Would you recognize the transcript?
I believe so.
Does that appear to be volume 2 of the transcript from 2017?
Yep.
Your testimony begins on page 797. So let me look there. So this is page 797 of volume 2 of that transcript. Is that right?
Yes.
And your testimony begins on or about line 11. So let's look at some things you said. Page 798, lines 10 through 11. I'm going to read a sentence there. You say, actually, let's start at line 8. The attachment D schedules look exactly like the attachment A schedules, except for D6. For D, the D schedules will include actuals. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Drop down to lines 16 through 17. You say, well, so we'll have a number comparable to the 54, but it will be based on actuals. Did I read that correctly? Drop downs to 24 to 25. Or 23, I'm sorry. So at that point, what happens after, at that point, the difference between the projected 54 and whatever that actual, the difference in that is what the parties will have the opportunity to look at for if the expenses go up to determine if, they were appropriate, if the expenses that went up were appropriate, but they'll have the opportunity to look at the difference between what we projected and what was actual. Anything greater than what we asked for is subject to an additional review. Did I read that correctly? And that's actually a reference back to the portion of Order 7 that we looked at earlier, isn't it? That we can do a prudence review based on expenses that exceed the projected amounts.
I don't know that when I made these statements that I was referring specifically to Order 7. I don't know the timing of that.
But that's effectively what Order number 7 said, right? In the sentence I read you earlier.
You'll have to read it to me.
Well, it's in the record, so. Let's drop down to line 22. Again, I'll read it aloud, you follow along. And then line 12, the projected year FRP revenue, that line, if you look at note 3, that line will be the actual FRP revenues that we collected in 2017. So we'll be comparing what the actual revenue deficiency was based on actuals and compare that to the revenues that we actually collected. Did I read that correctly? And that's actually describing line 12 of attachment D6, right?
For 2017. It was
Indeed.
specifically related to 2017.
Sure it is. And then down below that, you read what note 3 used to say on lines 9 through 13, right? You say, if you look at note 3, it says projected year driver FRP revenues used in the historical year netting calculation are the revenues from the previously projected year that are now the subject of the netting. Is that what you said? You deny that you said it? And then you say that is kind of a circular sentence, which I think you're speaking aloud what we were all thinking, right? That's what you said, right?
Yes, I was reading note 3.
And then Commissioner Wills says that's confusing, right? And then you say that the OG&E tariff made it clearer. And then you say, but what that refers to is the actual revenues that we collect in 2017. You agree?
Yes.
And then, as a result of the commission order, based on this exchange, they changed note 3 to say what it says now, right?
I believe that's what happened.
Okay, so it used to be a circular sentence that was confusing, and then they made it simple, right?
Okay.
Because they wanted it to be simple, right?
It's still confusing.
Not to everyone. They changed it so it would be simple. Don't you agree? Because you say what that refers to is the actual revenues that we collect in 2017, and then our esteemed former commissioner, Wills, says should probably say that. And then you agree with him, right?
Yes.
And then they changed the tariff based on that exchange in the order that came out after that hearing, didn't they?
The tariff was changed after the ordinance.
And the note now says something a lot simpler than what it said before, right? Note 3.
It is much simpler, yes.
Got it. And you agreed with Commissioner Wills that it should probably just say the actual revenues that we collect in 2017, right?
Again, that's what the transcript says, and we were referring specifically to 2017, not.
Okay, so you thought that the note should vary from year to year?
That's not what I was saying.
Well, you're trying to segregate 2017, so I'm trying to understand.
Have to look at this thing again.
All right, you're talking about note 3, right?
Yes, we're talking about note 3.
And you were talking about it back then, right?
Yes.
And back then it said something different, right? It says what you said on lines 9 through 13, right?
Yes.
And you agreed with the commission that that was too complicated and it needed to be simple, didn't you?
That's right. It's simple.
Well, then she can say no.
No,
Okay. So you did not respond, yeah, when Commissioner Wills told you that it should just say it's the actual revenues we collect?
I said yes, I did not say it needs to be simpler, you're putting words in your mouth, Mr. Kinsler.
But you called it a circular sentence, didn't you?
It is.
Is that simple? A circular sentence? And then she said that's confusing, and you said yes, right? And then you said a different tariff, OG&E's tariff, made it clearer. Isn't that a synonym of simpler?
I would agree that the language that's in note 3 now is simpler than the language that was in note 3 at that time.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on. Let's look at lines 13 through 16. On the next page. You say, starting on line 13, the line 12 will be, we are putting into rates 70 million. Now, and whatever we actually collect in 2018 could be 70 million, could be more, could be less. Is that what you said? So what you're saying there is that what's going to be on line 12 is what you're putting into rates, right?
For 2017.
Right. But you agree that note 3 was not going to change in 2018 until the commission made you change it, right?
I'm not following you on the question. I'm not sure what you're trying to ask.
Well, maybe that's by design. You agree here that what is put into rates is going to be reported on line 12 of attachment D6, correct?
For 2017, because in 2017, the only thing that was went into the rate was the 2017 projected revenue change. So it was very easy that the amount that we collected was the amount that went on that. In the very next year, that's not the amount, because the total amount includes both the amount we had already collected in 2013, which is necessary, we assume we continue to collect it, and plus the revenue increase. So the revenue increase is the number that goes, that is associated with the historical year, goes on line 12, line 12 B6, I believe, anyway, it goes on B6. It's the first year.
So you intended,
Excuse me, first year, 2017, was the only year that the total revenue that we collected pursuant to the FRP, all of those revenues went on B6. Every year since then, the total revenues have been segregated between the different pieces as outlined on Schedule A2.
it's your testimony sitting here right now that what you were describing back in 2017 should have been qualified to only apply to 2017. Is that what you're saying?
I did qualify it for 2017. I said that the amount that was collected in 2017, I did qualify it.
Isn't it true that this whole discussion was to provide an illustration of how the tariff should work?
For that year.
But did you say that?
Well, I think if we take what you're trying to get me to say to its logical conclusion, then the tariff, if total FRP revenues that we collect in any year goes on D6, then that means all of the cumulative revenues that we collected goes there, and we would have been over collecting by a tremendous amount of money. If that's not possible, you cannot put the total amount. Only in 2017 did the total amount go there.
Okay, let's look at the question that was asked by Chairman Thomas that precipitated your whole discussion. Starting on line 16 of page 797. He asked, would you please walk through the operation of how the cap works in the projected year and the cap works with respect to the true-up year and any monies that are not yet recovered, if that happens, your view of how that flows into another tariff filing, which I guess would be a Schedule A of the next year. And then that precipitates that whole discussion that we've been looking at. Do you agree?
Yes, that came after that.
So you were asked to describe how the tariff works, not how it works in a given year, right?
In order to make my explanation, I used the specific year.
Sure, but it was supposed to be illustrative, correct?
For that year, yes.
No, for the tariffs operation in general. That's the question you were asked, wasn't it?
But again, if you are trying to tell me that I need to put all the revenues that were collected in a given year on D6, then the amount that should go on D6 for this year would not be the 57 million that you're saying, it would be closer to 191 million.
Let's be clear, I'm not saying that.
Yeah, I believe you are. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, here's what, Mr. Chairman, what offered a stipulated bidding is very expensive in the record with this one. Move this along.
I'm almost done, Your Honor. I think it's important for her to look at what she actually said back in 2017 so we can all understand what she meant to. Let's look at 804, lines 6 through 7. Well, let's start on line 5. Commissioner Wills asks you, it's not cumulative. Answer, no, it's not a cumulative netting adjustment. Did I read that correctly?
You read those two lines there.
And then drop down to lines 12 through 14. And if we're over the cap, we'll never look at the difference between those again. Did I read that correctly?
What line is that, I'm sorry?
Line 12 through 14.
That's right.
Drop down to 24 through 25. Each year, the netting amount is based on a new year. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, 805. Commissioner Wills asks you a question. Well, what if we're in a situation where we're always bumping up against the cap and there are going to be amounts that haven't yet been spread in rates that are being netted up? I guess, do those amounts persist even in years after the succeeding year? Answer, no, you can't count them twice. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you're reading correctly.
And then the portion of the testimony that you cite in your testimony, your direct testimony this year, appears on lines 21 through 24, correct? There's a question mark at the end of that sentence, is there not? And isn't that a rhetorical question? Because isn't it your position back then that you could not do the thing that you are describing, to assume that you did collect some and you didn't collect the other?
No, my position was not, I did not say you couldn't do it.
So why is there a question mark?
So,
Is there some inflection?
there probably was. It's very difficult to just read these pages, especially taking this excerpt out. It was a rhetorical question, because then I answer it within that amount you collected in that year. I believe that was the year.
Okay. So that assumption that you described right there, that's the assumption that Entergy's whole position relies on this year, right?
Yes.
So it's your testimony that all of these statements you made back in 2017 were clear that this was the position the company was going to take this year?
The assumption that I made then was, yes, we would have to be able to segregate the revenue that we collected into its various components based on how the rate was developed. The rate that was billed and approved was developed.
So why did you say no to Commissioner Wills on line 11?
I need to read the
It's there for you to read. She said, I guess do those amounts persist even in years after the succeeding year? No. You can't count them twice. The amounts do not
I
persist.
believe he was talking about the amount over the cap, and the amount over the cap do not persist. If we exceeded the cap was $50 million, and the revenue change was $60 million, there would be $10 million that was over the cap. That we don't ask for, that's a revenue change. If we were to ask for it again in D6, we would ask for the true up, the netting, and the 10 million we didn't get to collect that year. But that is not what we've done. We've calculated the netting adjustment, just like D6 says, and as I said earlier, the cap calculation is a year-over-year calculation. What is your total revenue change for that year? Does it exceed the cap? If it exceeds the cap, we can't collect it. That's part of the overall reasoning or the reasoning behind the act for stable rates, for just and stable rates, so that the revenue change does not exceed 4% in any year. That's the distinction. If we can't collect it in 1 year, we can't record an asset, and then on top of all of the other expenses that we ask for that 10 million. We don't. We don't record a regulatory asset. We don't ask for it again. Each year stands on its own. You make the calculation for that year, compare it to the cap. If it's over the cap, we don't collect.
Okay. Your position is that the company did not collect the band rate adjustment from 2019, right?
The historical or
The band rate adjustment.
in the projected year or in the negative?
The company's position today is that the company did not collect the portion of the 2019 increase associated with the ROE band rate adjustment, correct?
We did not collect the netting adjustment.
No. You say that in 2019, what was collected was the 2017 netting adjustment, correct?
That's right.
Okay, and you say what was not recovered was the 2019 band rate adjustment,
Yes.
correct?
2019 projected year band adjustment.
Your methodology effectively carries forward that 2019 band rate adjustment for collection in this netting, does it not?
It does not.
I said effectively.
No, it does not even effectively do it.
How many angels dance on the head of a pin? All right. Your position is the company is not creating a regulatory asset to collect this 2019 money?
Absolutely, I'm not creating a regulatory asset to collect that money.
But you are testifying that the effect of the company's methodology is not to carry forward the 2019 band rate adjustment? In effect, by underreporting the revenues on D6 line 12, do you not carry forward the 2019 band rate adjustment for collection next year?
No.
All right.
I'm collecting the netting adjustment.
As EAL has determined that it should function, right?
As we calculated it, yes.
Right. And you've already agreed that there's nothing in the tariff that supports that calculation, right? Okay. Just a moment, Kyle. Nothing from there. Your Honor, I think I need to move the introduction of 1607 ABC's hearing to the 3. Did you say back at 2?